Thank you, Skip. It's a pleasure to be here at the Clinton School. It's a pleasure to meet someone who actually claims to have read the book. I don't know which is rarer, me coming here or meeting someone who's done that. I feel like I've hit the nerd trifecta here today. I get to give a book signing, get to sign my book, get to give a public lecture, and got interviewed maybe for NPR. The only thing that'd make this nerdier maybe is if I could read about this in the New York Times in my hybrid car, like going to a farm stand or something like that. but it is really nice to be here. In fact, I was telling Nikolai, who was so helpful earlier, that the last time I was in this neighborhood, I was running the marathon, and I was never happier to see this building because it meant I was about done. And running may be a kind way of describing what I was doing at that point. It's also great to be back here in Arkansas. I began my work on this project at Lyon College back in 1993 when I first did a project looking at the history of that school's football team as it rose and fell from after World War I to the Great Depression, then it came back again after World War II and left again when the baby boom students left. So, and glad to have it back again. But you could say that my interest in athletics began long before I was academically interested in it. Here I am, if it's work, there we go, listening to probably a recording of a football game, because I was that nerdy, wearing my Oakland jersey at the time, and I think that's camping here at Blanchard Springs on a very comfortable cot. I grew up in Tennessee, and so I wore a lot of orange and white in college, thanks to my roommate who picked out all my outfits, and I appreciated that. But you should all know that at least I'm raising my family right. And so thanks to Mallory, my niece, thanks to Aunt Lori, my daughters learned how to call the hogs and to say woo pig suey, and she may be the only person in Massachusetts who knows how to do these things, except for her sister. But it wasn't until I went overseas. I had, thanks to the Rotary Foundation, the Rotary Club of Arkansas, I was able to study in Scotland for a year. And over there, I learned a little bit about what it was like to see American sports from overseas, from a foreign perspective, from the playing fields and from the courts somewhere else. I played soccer in Lyon with Scott Stricker over there. We've gained weight, Scott. Hate to say that. And played basketball in Aberdeen. I specialize in playing sports that no one else in the community plays. But I was good friends with a guy who played professional soccer in Scotland, played at the highest level. And you can make your jokes about the highest level of Scottish soccer. I welcome those jokes. But he was amazed when he visited me in Tennessee and Ohio State that this is a guy who played for Scotland, who played for his country. And he had never seen stadia like this. He could not understand, and through his eyes, it made me want to understand why a university would have a stadium that seats 100,000, 105,000. And what had normally seemed natural to me, seemed normal, I began to see as something different, something other, and something worthy of historical investigation. Now, in many ways, that's what history is, right? It's a study of why things change. What are the inflection points? What are the times when things move in different directions? It's also, though, the study of why things stay the same. And I should note at the Clinton School that Game Changers is copyrighted by Mark Halperin. Is that how? It's the term you can't use. But it's a study of why things stay the same. And so in my book, which I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about, is I look at a period when some things change, some things stayed the same. And I'm very interested in why that was. Now, I'm old, so I'm on Facebook. And on Facebook, there's something going around, at least among academics, are trying to explain your dissertation, trying to explain your research project in a couple of sentences. So here's the book, in case you don't want to buy it, and the people from University of Arkansas Press, and my mother would be sad if that was the case. But the book argues that depression was bad. The book argues that football stayed profitable, but not as profitable as it had been before. I tried to argue that colleges use sports to teach men and women very different things, and it worked, but some people resisted, and we're talking largely for white folks. For African Americans, the lessons are a little different, and we'll talk about that in a second. Also, the book argues that citizens, legislatures, and alumni cared more about sports than academics, and the officials cultivated that and built from that. So what I'm going to focus on in the talk today, I think, is this notion that colleges use sports to teach men and women different things. And so that's where I want to focus. As a historian, though, you can't start where you say you're starting, right? There's always a backstory. There's always something else you need to talk about. So brief history of college athletics. American college athletics were intended to connect American colleges to the British university system, to Oxford and Cambridge in particular. And so most of the first college athletic contests were crew races or track and field events, but mainly crew. And we often think now about the golden age, when things were pure. But I'll tell you, we talk about, was it Tostitos, Fiesta Bowl, all these bowl games that have sponsors. The very first college athletic event was sponsored by a railroad company, and they had it at a distant lake, so people would have to use that railroad in order to get there. So it was commercialized from the very beginning. College football quickly became very popular, and this is an image of an early college football game. It was a rough game. It was a tough game. It was played at the elite colleges, and as this cartoon shows from 1906, the 12th player in every game is death. In 1905, 1906, 18 players were killed in games across the country, but mainly in the East Coast. And it caused such a crisis that the president, Theodore Roosevelt, had to call together the directors of the major universities that played, the traditional athletic powers of Princeton and Harvard and Yale, and called them together. And this is what led to the creation of the NCAA. We should remember, of course, that the Ivy League is first and foremost an athletic conference more than just a grouping of academics. But college football survived. And in the 19-teens and 20s, you had the construction of a lot of different large stadia. Here's an example. I think this is a laser pointer. Oh, yeah. So here's an example of a replica they were selling when Yale was building the Yale Bowl. Here's a program from Ohio State which founded it's the Horseshoe, which is known now as Now. It was opened in 1922 with a loss to Michigan, of course, with a seat of more than 70,000. Here you see the expenditure, right? In 1903, Harvard spent $250,000 to build a stadium larger than Fenway Park in the Boston area. In 1913, Yale spent $400,000, or what Arkansas probably pays for a backup offensive line coach, to create a stadium that's larger than Gillette Stadium where the Patriots play now. In the 1920s, more than at least 7 other universities, built stadia that seated 70,000 people or more. This was a significant investment in American college athletics, and it made changing the course very difficult if you have these loans to service. So what I'm interested in, though, is how and when things changed and why they did. In the 1929, 1930s, when I say the 30s, I'm talking about a long 30s, really 29 through 41, there were 2 significant factors here. One is the economic crisis. We know Depression happened. We know it was bad. We can talk about that in a little bit if you're interested. But the more important thing that was interesting to me is the Carnegie Report, written by Howard Savage, called American College Athletics, in which he and his team studied college athletic programs around the country for years. And they produced a 200-some-page document. And see if some of their conclusions might sound familiar to you. The question they asked is not so much whether athletics in their present form should be fostered by the university, but how fully can a university that fosters professional athletics discharge its primary function? By professional athletics, they mean paid coaches, students who were there primarily for athletics. The question is, how can universities be universities if they have big-time sports? Something else that may sound familiar to those of us who care about college sports. The athlete is the most available publicity material the college has. A great scientific discovery will make good press material for a few days, but nothing to compare to that of the performance of a first-class athlete. Thousands are interested in the athlete all the time. And if you have sports talk radio, you see this is true, while the scientist is at best only a passing show. I know I'm back in the South when I turn on the radio and I hear, and especially in the spring, instead of hearing discussion, I live near Boston now, instead of hearing discussion of the Bruins and the Red Sox and the Celtics, I hear discussion of the backup linebackers and how they're looking in spring drills for the Razorbacks. That's when I feel like I'm at home. So the question for the Savage posed is, what are we going to do about this? What's the charge here? And he says, this is what has to happen. This is a landmark public event. And he said, the paid coach, the gate receipts, the special training tables, the costly sweaters, you're worried about sweaters, the extensive journeys in special Pullman cars, think about first-class travel now, the recruiting from the high schools, the demoralizing publicity showered on the players, the devotion of an undue proportion of time to training, the devices for putting a desirable athlete but a weak scholar across the hurdles of exams. How do you get these people into school? These ought to stop, Savage and his crew argued, and the inter-college and intramural sports be brought back to a stage in which they can be enjoyed by a large number of students, in which they do not involve an expenditure of time and money wholly at variance with the idea of honest study. So this is Savage's argument. And as you all know, this is when America gave up college athletics, right? No, it didn't. So the question for me is what happened here? What happened? And what happened is, in a time of great economic distress, in a time when debates are taking place on colleges about any number of things. Here's a student newspaper from the University of Texas from 32, the benefits of higher education, right? No help wanted, these men are standing in a line. What's going to happen after graduation? What? It's something a lot of folks have thought over the last several years. But this is an essay with a student publication saying that college students and workers will be shot to protect capitalist investments. Others are arguing at this time the truly radical notion that we should treat all citizens as citizens. And the president of the University of Texas, Benedict, was not in favor of this at all. And what happened then is that as the finances went down, you can see at Ohio State, the drop from almost 450,000 to 130,000 by 32, 33. It happened in Illinois. It happened anywhere I show you, Texas and other places. They had to come up with justifications, not only to preserve their own jobs, but they thought to preserve America, the America they understood. That there was great interest and excitement. This is a photo from the Ohio State-Notre Dame game of 35, a game that CBS honored in 1950 as the most exciting and best college football game of the first half century. But it's a game they didn't repeat. They had incredible turnout, but after 2 games, they stopped doing it because of all the turmoil it caused. Notre Dame came to Columbus, Ohio to practice. They had 10,000 people around the practice field chanting anti-Catholic slurs at them. They decided that it's not worth it, the way that this could divide a campus even though it was profitable. There's great interest, great excitement. The stadiums were often full, but they're often full because they were giving away tickets, as they did at Tennessee, because they thought it was just embarrassing to have a stadium this big and have no one there. At Ohio State, they started selling tickets for 10 cents each, where that 2 years before had gone for $2 each. But the most important thing, I argue, is getting to the topic of the book, is that the college athletic administrators thought that athletics were the way to preserve the America they knew and they loved. What they did is they defended the established order. They defended the established quo by offering these idealized images of competitive and democratic and successful American athletes as the people who would save Western civilization. They used explicitly political rhetoric to make their point that intercollegiate athletics were the important tools not only for continuing amateur athletics, but for preserving capitalism, preserving democracy from its many serious challenges. So what I did in this book is I looked at the correspondence among the different administrators. I looked at athletic officials writing to other athletic officials. I looked at conference folks. I looked at coaches. And what I found is they're having what seems to be odd connections. There's this one memo that came from the president of NCAA to Lynn St. John, who was at Ohio State and is in the Basketball Hall of Fame. He's writing about how, this is 2 parts of a memo. The first part he's talking about, hey, man, thank goodness Iowa finally voted out this senator who had spent the previous 10 years in Griffith's telling attacking the existing capitalist and economic system and advocating the redistribution of wealth. So part of a memo is, hey, Iowa voted this guy out. Part B, he says, is an athletic conference finally got rid of their commissioner who wanted to who criticized college athletics and wanted to think about reorganizing them. They're connecting politics and athletic administration throughout their rhetoric. And so one of them wrote back, they want to witness an era of sanity, which the demagogues and the invaders against constructive criticisms of athletics and wealth will be less prominent than they have been. They're attacking Roosevelt. They did not like President Roosevelt and the collectivism they said he represented. They hoped for sanity to emerge. So I've got a lot of examples of this, and I'm happy to give you more if you want. But here's one where, again, the president of NCAA is writing to St. John. He says, well, Saint, he calls him Saint. It's at 36, right after the election had happened. We took an awful licking yesterday, didn't we? I was reconciled to a Roosevelt victory, but I never dreamed it would be a landslide. Apparently, America wittingly or unwittingly sold her vote. If things don't work out well the next 4 years, they can't blame you and me because we did what we did. And they have other rhetoric, again, where they're talking about comparing comparing someone who wanted to restrict the practice length. Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin's practicing too long. They compared it to rank communism of the worst sort. This is worse than Gandhiism. It's worse than Stalinism. They're taking small things like this and making it really big because this is what they believed. This is Griffith writing in 32. The United States is in a temporary slump, but we'll come out of it. There may be a world war. But if the nation's economic structure is destroyed, think about that. If the nation's economic structure is destroyed and a new social, economic, and political philosophy takes the place of our present national philosophy, then it won't be necessary for anyone to give heed to that which we have come to think of as college athletics. Our entire philosophy of athletics is inextricably interwoven into our American philosophy of life. We are a capitalistic nation. We believe in champions and championships. We believe that champions should win by the fair means. As President Hoover has pointed out, it's like one time you hear people citing Hoover as a great example. Communism would hold the speed of the swiftest at the slowest. Is it not clear then that if we continue to hold to the American conception of competition, we're going to continue along familiar and similar lines in athletics? They thought that by preserving college athletics, they would teach the young men and women, or the young men who are doing this, how to be the leaders of a democratic capitalistic nation. And they were afraid that otherwise that would go the other direction. They also sincerely believed that by having these contests, they could teach the people, the tens of thousands of people who watch them, that this is how Americans behave. We have winners, we have losers, we compete, we don't cry about it. This is their vision of what they wanted. This is how they were going to preserve democracy through sports. I just love that picture as a transition. The women's version, for women, the rhetoric is exactly the same, or the goal is exactly the same for white women. The goal is exactly the same, that they're going to teach these women how to be good Democrats, how to, not Democratic Party, but how to be good Americans. And they're going to use sports to do it. But the system of doing that is very different. I think this reveals a lot about what they expected from men and women at the time. Most people don't know, especially if they haven't read the book. Skip knows this because he read it. Don't know that women's college athletics existed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It existed. It was popular at Ohio State. They get 1,500 people for a game. When there were only 500 women who attended the school, it was popular. People wanted to play. People did play. But it went away. And if I had to ask you, who do you think killed women's athletic programs? Who's the culprit here? Dean Johnson? Who you blaming for this? Yeah, you have. Well, you should. Skip can tell you. Who do you think would blame? If we're looking for bad guys in this, in the 1920s, who's cutting off women's athletic programs? I assumed it'd be men. It wasn't. It was led by women. Women physical athletic directors, women physical educators ended women's athletics, competitive women's athletics, at least for white college students. And they did so because they wanted democratic sports. But their vision of democratic sports was completely different. What they wanted was a game for every girl and a girl in every game. That every woman have the exact same opportunity. That no one would be elevated based on skill, no one would be denigrated based on skill, that no one would be given more resources than others, that it would be exactly the same for everyone, which is the opposite of what the men were doing. They valued consensus and cooperation, and that's what they thought women needed to learn in college: how to cooperate, how not to seek individual attention, how to work as part of a team, how to avoid glory. And they feared, as they wrote, intense, highly specialized type of competition because this activity tends to tear down real values and set up false ones. In the same hallways as men athletic administrators, both talking about how we prepare people for democracy in a time when this was the debate of the era, they're coming to completely different conclusions. And one way they did it, that was, okay. I'll tell you what the first part of the quote says. Forget that. So that was a really interesting quote that you have to read the book. It's like a teaser to find. So what they did is they came up with these play days, and I think these are a great way to think about what was happening in these sports. So I've asked this. I teach a sports history class at my school, and I've asked my students, if you had to design, I'll ask you this, if you had to design a program where you brought people together from different schools and you wanted them to play sports but not compete, what rules would you put in place to have that happen? What do you think? No scoring, right? So that's one of the rules. So they brought people together with no scoring. So you wouldn't keep score. No scoreboards whatsoever. I mean, you would actually score in the games, but there was no scoreboards. There's no way anybody could walk up and see who was winning. What else would you do?
Everybody plays.
Everybody plays. Everybody plays equally, right? Good. That's what they do. What else would you do? No publicity, no trophies, no teams that are permanent. What they would do is, it's remarkable. Imagine if you got folks from Hendrix and OBU and Harding and Lyon together, and you brought them all together, and they're going to play sports. They came there for that day. But they're not wearing their Lyon shirts or their Hendrix shirts or their OBU shirts. They're wearing, they divide them up, pink, blue, green, red, pink, blue, green, red, and you divide them up, so red plays blue. But then what happens, though, is after a while, red team wants to beat blue team. They're looking to say, hey, we're coming after you, pink. You know, that's how they roll, right? So what they would do is then they'd make them change shirts. So the blue team wouldn't be, so they wouldn't even have that kind of competition. They designed these entire things to prevent these women from being competitive at all. They wanted to be active, they wanted to be healthy, but they did everything possible to prevent them from being competitive. And they did this for really 3 reasons. They thought that if they could identify elite athletes, that these women would get disproportionate resources, disproportionate attention, and that would be bad. It would be undemocratic. They were afraid that the women would become more like men, would become masculinized, I guess, because they thought competition was a masculine virtue. This is one of the things that one of the athletes wrote about, or one of the physical educators wrote about this. One of the most, if people compete, one of the most precious qualities of girls' character is endangered. Girls like basketball and baseball are competitive sports. They develop ugly muscles ugly in girls, as well as scowling faces, the competitive spirit. An inevitable consequence, your girls may find it more difficult to attract the most worthy fathers for their children. What is this, right? So just looking at this, what are they concerned about? Huh? Yeah, it's eugenics, right? This is they're talking about race suicide in some ways. They're talking about how these middle class or aspirational middle class white women are not going to be able to find people to father their children. And why not? Because they're being too masculinized. The other fear, though, was they would be recognized, and by masculine, they often were using that as code for becoming lesbians or having homosexual attractions. The other fear, though, was that they would be sexualized as being too feminine. And so part of what was happening in the athletic leagues that were not controlled by physical educators is you had these women being treated as sexual objects. So oftentimes when they built college gyms for women in the 20s and 30s, they built them without windows so men couldn't watch them play. They, at the AAU tournaments in the 20s and 30s, they would often identify a most valuable and the most beautiful player. They would, there's a tournament, a team in Texas that was drawing about 500, women's basketball team was drawing about 500 people per game, but they switched to uniforms. So they cut them really short shorts and orange satin, kind of shiny, and suddenly they're getting 5,000 guys there to pay to watch these women run around and sweat. They were afraid of this. There's a tournament in Ohio where they made the teams compete. They were just women who were prepared to play, but they made them compete in bathing suits instead of the regular outfits. So there's this fear of they're becoming too masculine or they're becoming too feminine and they're being exploited for their sexuality. So they also were desiring to control their bodies, this kind of race suicide eugenics thing. They were trying to teach women to use their bodies appropriately and to display them appropriately. And so what I found in these schools all across the country, this one's from Maryville College, it's a school like Lyon, a little church-affiliated school in the hills of Tennessee, is that you could get 1/6 of the points necessary to get an athletic letter, which was much smaller than a men's athletic letter, by doing these things. If they slept from time lights cut out till 6 a.m., with the windows open from top to bottom, for most of the month, you could help get an athletic letter. If you bathed daily in water, it wasn't too hot or too cold, you could get points towards an athletic letter. I'm sorry to say this in the South, but if you refrain from drinking Coca-Cola, you could get points towards an athletic letter. If you moved your bowels daily, preferably after breakfast, and who's the person charged with keeping track of this? I don't know. Probably the dean of students, right? Then you can get an athletic letter. If you change your underwear daily, some of these are good things to suggest. But the idea that women could use these things to get athletic points tells us something that they were interested in things that they weren't interested about for men. Now, to talk about this for a second, we've been talking, or I've been talking, maybe too much, about college athletics as if there's a uniform experience. Most people who attended college in the 1920s were white. But there were, as here in Little Rock and other places, colleges, African-American, HBCUs. And the women's athletic programs for them, I think it's very interesting, never adopted this anti-competitive model. Why might that be? Any ideas? Because black women could never expect to live a life of leisure. They were going to work. They were going to work probably in someone's house. Even if they were nurses, they're going to be vulnerable. They'll be vulnerable to assault. They'll be vulnerable to sexual assault. You need to know how to throw an elbow. These women, the people who are running their programs knew that they needed to train their women to be able to protect themselves. So one of the best articles on African-American women's sport at this time is by a scholar named Rita Liberti. And she writes, I think the title is, we acted like ladies, but we played like tigers. This notion that, look, we can play by games, we can be proper, we can do all the things that are expected of the white college students. But for African-American women, the expectation was that sports would prepare you for life, but life was be tougher and have more challenges than it would for white folks. So I just wanted to mention that. It's not, talk about it more in the book, and I wanted to get it out there. What I think is interesting about this, and this is why my book, if there's one thing that does well, I think, is it considers women's sports equally as men, and that's fairly rare in the literature. But what happens is, and I said this long 1930s, is that the 30s begin with these challenges to men's athletics. But a little earlier than that, there were challenges to the women's college sports. And they have basically 15 years of no white women, or very few white women, playing intercollegiate sports. By 1938, there was a challenge to this, and it came at Ohio State. Gladys Palmer was elevated to a position of power before her time. The person who was the athletic director or head female physical educator at Ohio State died, and Palmer was elevated. She got the job earlier, maybe 10, 15 years earlier than should have. She's probably the youngest one in her position across the country. And she came, with her colleagues, to challenge this notion of what women could and should be able to do. So what she did is she and her friends, because they felt student pressure, and because they felt they themselves, when they were coming through the system, they had wanted to compete. They had wanted to have the same opportunities as men, or at least similar opportunities as men. They were having students who were asking them, hey, can we do this? I'd love to do this. This woman named Helen Jenkins, who was a great marksman. She could shoot a gun. And she wanted to be, her lifetime dream, she said, was to be in the All-American team. She was probably good enough. The men's coach at Ohio State, which had a great program, said, yes, she can shoot. She could be on our team. Had the support of the men's coach, had the support of the women's athletic director, but the athletic board said, no, we're not letting this happen, even though she wouldn't have had to shoot even at the same time as the men, because riflery, you can shoot and record the scores and keep the targets. They said no, that they denied her her lifetime dream. Well, students like that, and their own experiences of Palmer and her friends, made them think they were prepared to challenge. And they wrote this great political document in 1938 that says, guys, we agree that women are different than men. We agree that we have to protect them from these abuses that will happen if men control women's athletics. But you have done your job so well, now we can reintroduce competition to women's sports. We can do it because you're so great at your job, you've trained us so well, you can trust us with this. And what they said was, what we should do is we should form a women's NCAA and use it to govern and administer competitive women's sports. And we should consider having a golf tournament. You know, how radical is that? They're going to have a golf tournament, and they're going to award trophies, and they're going to see they're going to keep score. And we should do that and say, send this message out, and they sit there. And they wait. 39 comes, nothing. 40 comes, nothing. 41, they're frustrated. They send a message out. One of the ladies, Mary Yost, goes to a conference and says, guys, we're going to do this. And the telegraph she sends back to Columbus reads simply, bombshell exploded, shrapnel everywhere. It's a bomb in the profession, not the bomb, it's a bomb. And what happens is that they call Gladys Palmer herself. You come to this next conference, and she's harangued. They invite her to a meeting and tell her to sit down and shut up, and everybody just yells at her the whole time. their memos, they're calling their people that have been their friends the whole time, she's just a louse now. Or all these people in the hallways are telling them, we could do this. Frankly, we have tennis tournaments at our school, but they won't say anything in public. They're saying, they're writing, these women are all jellyfish. They won't stand up where they believe. Well, the Ohio State women weren't jellyfish. They were vertebrates. They had backbones, and they were mad at this point. So they pushed forward and decided that they should have a golf tournament. And their argument is this. Instead of a girl for every game and a game for every girl, what Palmer argues is you can't legislate out of an individual the instinctive urge to compete. Competition is a human instinct. It's not a masculine instinct. And you can manage it for women. You can make it safe. And so they try to. But the stakes aren't small. They get, one of the best folders I found was the letters of people complaining about this potential golf tournament. So here's a prominent woman from the field from Iowa State saying that Ohio State is promoting an intensification of competition. Again, think of what the men are doing at this time. But they're promoting an intensification of competition at a time when our society is in such great need of better techniques of cooperation. I believe that democracy can adapt to rapidly changing economic and social conditions. It must, however, move away from the cutthroat competition of unregulated individualism toward acceptance of disciplined self-regulation and cooperative planning. Right? That's from Moscow. That's from Stalingrad. They want democratic athletics, not an athletics aristocracy. So the question is, what's Ohio State will do? They've ruined professional friendships. I think I may have mentioned before, people wouldn't sit down with Ohio State folks till the 60s at conferences. They would just get up and walk away. They send out applications and no one's signing up. They're really worried. But they realized what they did in the applications. They had a form where you had to sign up. You had to get your coach or your physical educator to sign up for it. And these women weren't signing anything. So they just took that line off. Within weeks, they had 30 women sign up. They show up. They have a golf tournament. They wear dresses. One woman's dress wasn't appropriate, so they escort her downtown so she could get an appropriate dress. And they have a golf tournament. The winning score is 75 on a really tough course. The same course the men had a national championship on the week before. And they're really happy about it. Gladys Palmer gives a speech at the end and says, the only thing that can stop us is from doing this again. We've been challenged. There are more observers there, critics there, than actual golfers. Their colleagues came to see what a disaster it was. But it wasn't a disaster. Palmer says the only thing that can stop us is if there's a war. She says this in July of 1941. Pearl Harbor, right? So it's not till 1946 that it's possible for them to have another golf tournament. They do. It's at Ohio State in 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53. No one else will host this thing, but they keep having it. By 56, the professional organization they say, we should form a committee, because it's a perfect academic thing to do, right? We should form a committee to discuss the propriety of doing what we've been doing for the last 15 years. And eventually, this committee comes around to think that it may be possible for women to compete openly in sports. So, the legacy of this. I would argue that this is the moment when we forever entrench men's college athletics in the big-time sports we have, right? We're calling the hogs. We're singing Rocky Top. We're doing all the things that OHIO, hang on Sloopy. We're doing all this in large part because college athletics survived the biggest test they could possibly have, a combination of a financial crunch and philosophical salvo. But they survive it for men's college athletics. And they do so because people want to preserve their jobs. They've invested a lot of money, but also because they thought sports meant something. And we get, because of this, Gladys Palmer and her buddies, her colleagues, we get on the road to having Title IX, which I would argue is some of the most important social legislation of the last 50 years. We're on the road towards Title IX, on the roads to modern women's athletics, toward the road towards recognizing that women can be competitive, women can be athletic, women can develop muscles, and they can be fully human and thrive in competition and be whatever else they are in life. And I would say that this period is the time we get there. Now, I know Skip's been looking at his watch. I think I'm right on time. But I've been told that you're the moderator of some questions. So we're in Arkansas. So feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Thank you for your time and attention. Can we agree first? She's cute, right?
All right. Good job, Brad. Thank you. All right. We've got Good audience here. Let's somebody's got to have some sports questions here.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
One thing with the Depression in the 1930s, to me, there were two schools that stood out that don't have athletic programs, and it's Sewanee and University of Chicago. What was it about that time that they were able to be so successful?
Well, Chicago did, right? So one of the things that happened in Chicago, and that's a great question, is that Chicago was a member of the Big Ten. Chicago had Amos Alonzo Stagg as its coach for a long time. He's, I think the coaching trophy is still named for him, or what used to be Division II trophy's named for him. But they lost their coach. They weren't successful. Chicago has always had a really pure kind of academic, Germanic, almost university model. And they realized that this isn't for us. And what's telling about Chicago's example is that other universities could have chosen the same thing. One of the universities I study public universities mainly in this study, is the University of California, which at that point was as elite academic institution as it is now. Like, they were trying to play only really good schools academically because they didn't want to weaken their brand. And they could have considered it, but they didn't. Chicago, I think it's a combination of the tough times, bad teams, and trying to fulfill what they think their mission was. I don't know as much about Sewanee. I know they have sports now. I have buddies who played for them, but I don't know in the 30s what their story was.
There was a book written about them where they traveled. They actually I think they were part of the SEC back then. But they did a trip where they shut out 3 big name teams.
Now that you mentioned that, I recall that. What's interesting as a Southerner and as someone who's interested in sports is just how much the South had a chip on its shoulder. And when Southern schools would play, just like American schools were trying to connect themselves to Oxford and Cambridge, right? We want to be like Oxford and Cambridge. We want to be like those British elite schools. American schools are trying to be like Harvard and Yale. And so, like, when Sewanee or Georgia would play Harvard or Yale and they'd win, it was news across the South. Those of us, many of you may know David Strickland, who's the head of the Butler Center here. Howard Odom, who's like one of the pioneering figures in Southern thought, and a great scholar, sociologist, I think, at University of North Carolina. He did this whole study that I found that was trying to show how the South can succeed at things it cares about. And what he had found is the South really cares about college football in the 30s. And he was holding this up as, hey guys, if we can do it here, we can maybe do it in academics, we can do these other things. It's just a funny study I found, that the South was using sports to kind of get even with the Yankees, or to prove that we're just as good as those guys. And that it's not just crackpot students, it's not just like people calling in like now who'd be on the message boards. It's the leading academics of the period saying this is the way the South is distinct and can prove its value. It's a good question. Thank you.
This is first. I've never actually said anything after all these meetings, but it's big for me. Sorry. I think that's exactly right. My dad and his 4 brothers were raised in Hartford in basically a ghetto, and he was an extraordinary athlete in all sports and went to Wesleyan, would never have had a chance to go to college except for the sports. And 3 of his brothers were chosen, but they were recruited to go down to Georgia, and that was too far away. From Hartford, that was too far away. They came back, they married their girlfriends. But my dad went on, got a master's, and ended up in industry. And so it was the American success story. So some of keeping that athletic thing going was giving, and I remember growing up in New Jersey. I didn't tell you all that, did I?
You just said y'all, that's all right.
That's right. Been here a long time. Going to Penn State, all the Penn State athletes, it was the way for kids to get out of mining.
Right. And so there's this whole, it's not a mythology, it's a reality that in the United States, education has been a pathway to success. It's not always this, but it's the surest road. And sports often get people there or get them to stay there. Skip mentioned we're on the serving the trustees in the Lion. One of the things we're looking at is, Lion Hendricks both added football teams in the last 3 years. It's a really interesting moment to be thinking about these things in Arkansas. Why are these small liberal arts colleges adding football teams? And then what are they doing are they getting different types of students on campus? Students they wouldn't have been able to recruit before. Can they keep them there? 20 years from now, it'll be really interesting to see what's happened because of these changes. But you mentioned like Penn State, and one of the things that's interesting to me and that I talk about later in the book is this notion of informal alumni. It fascinates me that people who never went to a school will wear snouts and call the hogs. No offense, Ward. But it just fascinates me. Like, I grew up wearing orange and white, and no one in my family attended Tennessee until I did. My kids know the words to Rocky Top. Sweet as Sody Pop. My daughters can say that. And it's absurd that they do. But there's something about college athletics. There's something about it that creates this connection. A sociologist, an anthropologist named Benedict Anderson talks about imagined communities, about how folks like to imagine they're parts of groups, and that it's a really strong tie. It's like kinship or religion more so than other ideologies. And I use that as a way to think about the ways colleges reached out to people, especially public universities, which ones I look at. So what does it mean you live in Arkansas, so you root for the Hogs, because they say Arkansas, that somehow they become us. They're we, we're going to play, Tennessee, we play Alabama this week. I'm not suiting up. If I am, Tennessee's in even worse trouble than we thought. But this notion that sports can draw people to schools and give them chances, and that sports can make people care about schools, often really, really passionately and irrationally, is something that's been happening since this time, and it's something they certainly cultivated in the 30s. One thing that happened in the 30s is state legislatures, a lot of schools didn't want to put their games on the radio because they thought that meant people wouldn't go to the game. But state legislatures in Florida and South Carolina and Tennessee and other places passed the laws and said, no, you're playing for us. You're going to put the game on the radio because we want a chance to participate. And I just think it's an interesting moment in kind of media history, but also this kind of creation of community. Thank you. You should speak up more often.
I haven't read the book since I saw it in manuscript form, so I can't remember if you talk about, was there ever a time when women's sports had even approaching the level of sports writing that men's sports ever had?
No, the sports writing you're asking about, like the press coverage? No, it's sports writing about women was a lot of nymphs, and then the nymphs took the field. A lot of American girls. There's a lot of stuff about tennis and basketball, but they're really sexualized. They're really idealized. Women are described in very kind of standard ways. And that's what scared a lot of folks who were worried about protecting women and their virtue, is that they're being treated as if they're sex symbols. And so in tennis, was it Suzanne Lenglen? Is she the French tennis player in the 20s who had cut her hair short, wore a little shorter skirt, wore lipstick when she played, and it was scandalized. So she played against someone I talk about in the book, Helen Wills, I think, from University of California, who was this all-American girl. And so she had long hair and wore the long flowing skirts. And so it's this kind of modern versus traditional, French versus American. But they were sports writing then, and I would say sports writing now, talks about women's bodies very differently talks about men's bodies. Maybe it wasn't quite as overt, but it certainly was the case back then. Does that help?
Yes, question.
Hi, I'm Sochi Delgado. I'm a class 11 here at the Clinton School. Has there been another time, or do you think that there will be another time when college athletics will have to be as redefined as it was during this time period?
I think it got set in concrete. That's a really good question, and I've thought a lot about it. I think the money's so big now. I think the thing that might change college athletics is our greater awareness of the physical damage that's happening to some of these players. Our awareness of, our discussion of football 15 years from now is going to be very different than it is now, because we're going to have longitudinal studies about what happens to high school players, what happens to college players. Students are getting, brain scans as setting baselines. I think it's going to be very different, very, very different. But ESPN, they're paying billions and billions of dollars for men's sports, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for women's sports. It's just big business. I think the big change will happen, and there are lawsuits about it now. I don't know what's going to happen in the short term. I think it's the question about should these people be paid. But the fundamental question they're asking back then is, can you reconcile an academic institution with basically a pro sports team? I think Americans have largely agreed that they don't really fit, but we kind of like cheering for the Hogs, or we love singing Rocky Top, and we're okay with that. So I think, I guess my answer is, one of the reasons I ended up writing the book is I think the 30s are when that decision was made. We can modify it, but we've gone too far down the road, I think.
Brad, you made a point about Title IX being, the great legislation. And let's take a look at soccer, where the U.S. men's soccer team may not even make the World Cup. And the U.S. women's soccer team could very well win the World Cup. And some people credit the success of the women to Title IX, and that college programs for women playing soccer developed, and that Europe and other continents, South America, did not move forward on women's athletics. Do you see this new chapter in women's athletics post-Title IX? I mean, again, when America looks at this, is there going to be a celebration of women winning the World Cup and American men not getting there? How's that going to play?
Well, first of all, it's a real good question, and I've thought a lot about it. I don't know if I have a definitive answer. I would say that many of the fears that the women had in the 20s and 30s have come true. That women play sports in, look at college, or look at even high school, like volleyball uniforms. They're still really tight, really small uniforms for a lot of women. There's no doubt that women are I think, their sexual allure is being capitalized on literally. A lot of programs are being run by men instead of by women. One of the things that women didn't want is if they became more like men's competitive sports, that the men would get the jobs, because all things being equal, men would get the jobs, and that's certainly been the case. There are any number of men who coach women, but I think maybe one woman who coaches men. But the bigger issue, I think, is, I think the United States have a competitive advantage in soccer because we have had 40, 50 years of Title IX, and other countries haven't had that, and that's the one sport where we're dominant. Women's basketball, we're dominant. I think they were also right in the 20s and 30s in saying that what decisions we make about who gets to play sports and what kind of sports they play has a lot to do with how our society develops. And I think that even if we never win another World Cup game in women's soccer, even if we never win an Olympic basketball in gold in women's basketball, there's been such tremendous changes and opportunities for women. And you think of these ads about, I'm going to run like a girl, and all these other things that, they're capitalizing on. Women can be strong, women can be confident, women can be all these things that are associated with sports, and they're not always being seen as being masculine. And I just think that's tremendous. I'm raising 2 daughters. I have friends who are raising daughters, and the idea that sports helps send the message. You can do whatever you can if you're talented and you work hard. Now we know in reality that there are limits to this. There are all kinds of barriers. It's not as fair for men or for women. That different races have many kinds of advantages. But that message is a different message than was being sent in the 30s, and I applaud where we're going.
I have a follow-up question to that. There has been all these run like a girl, do whatever, you can be athletic. How long do you think that it'll take for even high school and college facilities for women to catch up and actually treat women equally and spend as much money?
Gosh, I wish I could get there. I mean, one of the biggest problems in America is structural inequality, right? Things are baked into the system based on white privilege, based on who's hiring the coaches, who's setting the budgets. I wish it would happen. It's happening in some places, but like at UConn, Gino Auriemma is the most successful coach. I hate to say it, even more successful probably than Pat Summitt. Over the last 30, 40 years in almost any sport, I think he makes half what the men's coach makes at UConn. His teams sell out. They sell out 11,000, 12,000 seats, tickets a game. He can't get paid as much. I don't know. We have structural inequality. I hope people keep raising their hands, keep pointing it out. I wish we didn't have it in a lot of different ways. I think we'll get there, but the arc of justice is long. It bends towards the arc. I forgot, now I'm blowing the quote, I'm sorry. It bends towards justice, but it takes a long time to get there. And I'm hopeful but I'm not sure we'll see it soon.
This is a good read. It's a great story, and I think one that most people really had little idea about the emergence of how athletics changed America in the Depression and the war, and how America changed athletics. Let's thank Brad Austin and come visit with him and buy